And after 6 days Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Rise and have no fear. And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, Tell no one the vision, until the Son of Man is raised from the dead.
Well, today's setting is in the mountains. And how many people have been to the mountains? I need a show of hands today. All right. How many haven't been to the mountains? All right. We're gonna talk to those that have been and to those who haven't. There is one thing. I've been to the mountains a couple times. I've had that pleasure, that beauty that God shows you in the mountains, and it's something wonderful and beautiful. It's something dangerous and mysterious about the mountains. And I'm reading the 2 stories today, and I started thinking about when I was about 29 years old. I was a teacher down in Boca, and I got a free trip to go with a bunch of students, a trip to Europe for the seniors. And we went up to this mountain in the Swiss Alps, which are the highest mountains, in Europe. And there were these 3 peaks. They're called the Eiger, the Monk, and the Jungfrau. And the Jungfrau was the biggest one. And so we went up on this cog train, because it's so steep, you can't just drive a car. We went up on this cog train, and we get up to this village that's like halfway up the mountains. So there's times when you're just in the clouds, right there in this little teeny town that's just stuck up in the mountains there. And then every time I went outside or just even looked out the window, you would see the clouds, and they would like come and go, and they'd veil the mountain peaks, and sometimes you could see one of them and then the other one, but I don't think all week I ever saw all 3 peaks. But it's beautiful because as the clouds unveil, you see like the snowy peaks of the highest part of the mountains, like 10,000 feet. And I think we were up at about 5,000 feet, if I remember. So there's kind of this feeling when you're up there of mystery and magic and just like you just see the beauty all the time. And I was up there 3 days, and I remember just how gorgeous it was. So these stories about mountains today, about Moses and about Jesus, I like to imagine myself being there. So for those of you who haven't been up, I'm taking you on this trip, this free trip. And in this first reading that we have today, this is a pretty famous reading of Moses being invited by the Lord to go up the mountain. I mean, the Lord invites Moses and says, Come up to the mountain with me and wait there, and I'll give you tablets of stone with the law and the commandments. And so Moses set out with his assistant Joshua, and he went up the mountain of God. And the famous part is we know that when Moses came down, he had the 10 Commandments, right? That's the famous part of the story. But it doesn't get into that today. It just talks about him going up. And it says the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai, which is the holy place for the Jews, because that's where God gave Moses the 10 Commandments. And the cloud covered it for 6 days. And of course, on the 7th day, which is the day of the Lord, the Lord called Moses out of the cloud. And now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire, up in those mountains in the sight of the people of Israel. So we see Moses, just like his people did, the Israelites. Moses is going into this cloud, and they seem kind of like this dangerous fire up there, probably lightning from a storm up in the mountains. And what they see is, they see their leader, Moses, entering like into communion with God up in the mountains. And this is a very powerful image, and that's why Moses in the Hebrew Scriptures is like the man. He is the one, he is the prophet of all prophets. And then we skip over today and we get to the gospel that we just heard. And it starts out, curiously, and I'll get back to it, starts out 6 days after Peter had acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus took Peter and James and John up the mountain by themselves. And it doesn't really say why. There's no invitation like God said to Moses, come up and I'll give you these tablets of stone. But it just says Jesus invited them. And so he took them up, and then we hear this great story about Jesus being transfigured, that his clothes became dazzling white, that his face shone like the sun. And the theologians in the crowd, I know there's some in the back, that this is this image of Jesus now being greater than Moses. And so Jesus becomes the new Moses. But then there's this whole thing where the cloud also overshadows them, and there's a theophany, meaning God is actually speaking. And the disciples fall down in fear. And God says, this is my Son, my beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. And it's kind of an echo of what we heard when Jesus went, when he was baptized. It was the same thing. The clouds open up and God says, this is my beloved. This is my Son, whom I'm well pleased. But what happens is the disciples drop to the ground in fear, and by the time they kind of look up, Jesus is there by himself. And, my questions always are like, why? Why did this happen at this particular time in Jesus' walk on the earth with his disciples? Why did he take them up this mountain, and why was he transfigured before them? Well, where it falls in the gospel, because we know Lent, the season of Lent is starting next Sunday, it's kind of appropriate that Jesus took his disciples up and showed his true self to them, his divine self, before he goes back down into the valley and starts his passion and his walk to Jerusalem, his ultimate physical death. And back to that curious thing that it started with. 6 days after Peter had acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ, meaning the Messiah, or the Son of the living God, this happened, and Jesus invited him up. So I think that Jesus is showing a few of his disciples his true self, that he's divine. And then he gives them this order on the way down, don't tell anybody until I've been raised from the dead. Well, I don't know about you, but if I had seen Jesus in this transfigured, shining face, and his clothes were dazzling white, and this is before tide comes out and clothes become dazzling white, right? I would be talking to everybody about it. Let me tell you what happened. And then I also would be saying, John and James, you saw it too, right? Because in those days, one eyewitness was one thing, but many eyewitnesses were a lot more powerful. So for some reason, Jesus says this to them, but I think what he was trying to do was show Peter and a couple eyewitnesses, here's my real self, but yes, we got to go back down into that valley, and we got to continue the mission towards the cross and towards physical death and torture and everything we're going to hear about in Lent, right? Yeah. But remember this, because I'm divine. I am the Messiah. And there's going to be a different ending than the tomb. When Jesus dies and he's put into the tomb, the story ain't over. And I use the word ain't for a reason, right? We talked about ain't. It's not over because he's going to be resurrected. Do the disciples really understand this, walking their way down the mountain? Probably not. And we know the story, right? We've heard this story since we were little kids, right? But do we really kind of accept it? This is an important story, though, because Jesus is revealing himself not only to the disciples, he does it again today in this word that we just heard. We see him as the new powerful Moses. He's greater than Moses because not only did God invite Moses up to the mountain and just talk to him in the clouds, but Jesus actually walked up this mountain with his disciples. How I see that today is Jesus walks with each one of us. All right? Whether we've been up to the mountain with Jesus or not. And some of us have. Some of us had that great experience where God has come to us and we know that there's a God out there. We know that the Lord is resurrected. And we know that the Lord has transfigured not only himself but us just by knowing that. Okay? But there's other people that haven't had that experience. And the Lord is showing it to us in these words today. All right? I talk to people throughout the week. Let's be frank. This Riviera Beach is kind of down in the valley, right? We don't get too much good news. We do get some. I did meet a man yesterday. You all know him. He said he'd be here this morning. He said he finally got a job after 2 years. All right? That's a miracle in Riviera Beach, right? We had a man stand up here a couple weeks ago and say, I got a job, right? Those are small miracles in my mind. And if the clouds are unveiled and you can see that, you know that God's working in the world, right? It's starting to happen. I'm starting to hear that there's little things happening. And I also see it when people come up to me. I had a man that came here. He used to live, he said he used to eat here. He used to sleep here. He went to CARP, he don't know how many times. He called 211, he doesn't know how many times. He's lived in 100 different treatment programs. And I knew this guy 5 years ago, and I knew that he was in AA, and I think finally, after probably 20 years, he's in a good place now. And we sat right here where Tony is, and he told me about his life, how it's changed. But he told me that he was down in that valley for a long time, and doesn't even remember part of the valley. He was so low. He was basically buried in the tomb, right? So in his life, God has resurrected him. And he's supposed to start coming back here and helping those that need that hope. So I get to see a lot of times kind of the beginnings of what hopefully will happen here. And I thank God for it. Because we see so much bad, we got to see some good too, right? So what I want to tell you is, I rewrote this. Yesterday, I started out real down. When we're discouraged, we got to remember that that we're not in control. That Jesus is the Lord. All right? And when we're disgusted, down and disgusted, and let's be frank, there's a lot of that. Okay? In this world, it's a hard world. We're down and disgusted. Jesus is still the Lord. He's this transfigured Lord that we read about 2,000 years ago, but he's here among us today.
Yes.
He's right here in this church.
Amen.
People don't walk in this church on their own. You received a little call this morning to come. Okay? If you realize that, you're already talking, you're already getting the idea that the Lord works in everyone's life. And then when we make mistakes, and when we fall down, and when we're embarrassed, and when we're like, I don't want to come, Jesus is still with us. He's still walking with us. So today we see this invitation of disciples to come up the mountain and see the transfigured Lord. But Jesus reminds us, that it wasn't just like Moses' day when God invites Moses up to the mountain in the clouds. We have a God who walks with us. He walked with Peter. Peter says in the second reading today, we've been eyewitnesses of his majesty. For we received honor and glory from God when that voice was conveyed to him, saying, "This is my Son, my beloved, with whom I'm well pleased." Peter's saying, I was an eyewitness to this. And we know how humble Peter was. He was a fisherman. And so were the other two guys that came along for that day up the mountain. These were flatlander guys from the Sea of Galilee who thought they would just fish for, they'd go fishing every day for the rest of their lives. These aren't people that would go walk up mountains. But somehow they started walking with Jesus, and one day he took them up that mountain. Jesus is here today for us too. He asks each one of us. He's standing right there, and all he ever does is invite us. Just walk with me. Right? Just walk with me. Talk with me. Tell me what's going on. Let's see if we can figure this out. I've been down there in the valley, and we're going to hear in the next couple weeks Jesus walking his way purposefully to Jerusalem to his physical death, knowing, again it's knowing that God the Father is going to do something to transform him. Maybe not really knowing that he'll be resurrected, but knowing somehow through this walk of faith that his Father's going to bring him right back up. Because if he is the beloved Son of God, as we are, Amen. Right? He's going to lift us up too. Right? So walk with Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Amen.